Good morning and a very warm welcome to this EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me, as always, delighted to welcome Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive and Chief Economist at the EPC, and Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies, as we discuss the incoming European Commission team, Ursula von der Leyen VDL2, as we might call it, on the day of that Parliament vote, where we think we know the result, so we won't be trying to predict that, which will come in roughly an hour or so, but we will be looking at what we've learnt about the new Commission, what we think the hearings and that process has told us about the institutional balance over the next 5 years between Commission and Parliament, and also the impact of the arrival of a new Council President, and all of this seeking to answer the question, will the EU be better equipped to try to respond to the challenges posed by a second Trump administration in the White House? And we will delve into the challenges that Trump too poses in more detail, as well as the shape of his team and his policies becomes clearer. As always, totally interactive session. Click on the raised hands button if you would like to ask your question in person. Click on the Q&A button if you would like to write your question. In both cases, please be as brief as possible. So given that the vote is within the next hour or so, I think we should start, gentlemen, with VDL2, the new team. And Janis, perhaps in terms of what we've learned since the summer, so both in terms of the allocation of portfolios and the mission letters that Ursula von der Leyen sent to each of the commissioners designates, and then what, if anything, we learnt in the hearings, do you think we have learnt more about the shape of this new commission, where the focus is going to be, or is it pretty much as was initially outlined in July?
Well, let me start by first of all saying that it's good that we're getting to the vote today, that the likelihood is very high that you will have the votes you will require in the European Parliament. We'll see how it will be compared to the vote in July. But it's good to get this new commission in place, that it can start operating. It already has things on its agenda, it wants to deliver some things even in the first 100 days. So it's good that we get things started. And given the overall situation, including the election of Donald Trump, I think it's high time. Now, with respect to the specific question, I think we didn't learn that much. We knew what the Commission priorities include. We also knew that some of these priorities are more significant than others, including especially competitiveness, but also defense and security. So we didn't learn that much in terms of what the priorities will be. What we clearly have seen that which has to do with also the election of Trump, but not only. If you look into the Middle East, that at the end we will also see over the next 5 years that there will be crises that will very much determine also the agenda of von der Leyen 2, as it was von der Leyen 1, if you think back over the last 5 years. So in terms of actually what the priorities are, what the Commission will have to and will want to concentrate on, I think it is more or less clear. I think what we saw during the hearings, I'm sure we're going to go back to that in more detail, but was that there was also among those who had been designated commissioners an attempt to follow suit on what the Commission President had provided as guidance. Also, if you compare to what they were conveying in the hearings to what the mission letters towards them had been stating. So they were playing along the lines of the script of von der Leyen. And even when they were being challenged on certain issues, they were still being cautious and trying to make sure that they stick to what actually the Commission President, the old and new Commission President, had defined as being her political priorities.
So, Fabian, in terms of the focus and those priorities, as Janis said, very much the hearings underlining that shift in emphasis to, yes, Green Deal implementation continues, but this central focus on competitiveness, has that been reinforced by the hearings? And Janis saying they stuck to the script in the hearings. I'll come back to whether the hearings work or not a bit later on. But in terms of that sticking to the script, what have we learned about the commissioners themselves, the caliber of this team, and how that bodes for the way it's going to be run? Because Ursula von der Leyen in her first term had a very tight grip. She had occasional breakaways, mavericks, if you like, doing their own thing, but it was very centrally controlled and very tightly gripped. Do you expect to see the same thing this time around?
I would expect that it is actually even more tightly controlled. We did have some big personalities in the last commission. We also had, and in some cases publicly, disagreements between von der Leyen and some of the commissioners. I would expect a lot less of that happening, especially in the core portfolios. I think there it is very clear where the direction of travel is, and I think it is also very clear who's in charge. So what we are going to see is a more cohesive commission, which works in the same direction. Yes, there might be some outliers, but the overall direction is going to be clear. But I think what that also means is that the problem of bottlenecking is going to be even more present in this commission than it has been in the last. It already was a problem, but now even more than before, everything will tend to go through the center.
Yeah.
And as you say, less big personalities. Are there no, Janis, no Thierry Bretons in this mix? Are there no big beasts in this mix?
No, if you also, when you followed the hearings, you could see that in terms of the college and the caliber of the college, it is not along the lines of what we had over the past 5 years. It is clearly, and Fabian is right, something where the presidentialization of the commission is even further enhanced by the fact that the college itself does not include those characters who, over the past 5 years, in different moments in time, were also ready to oppose the commission president, were having differences of opinion, which you either knew about or you were aware about, if they weren't speaking about them openly. So there are some stronger calibers, so you can differentiate between the members of the college. Ribera did rather strong during the hearings. She also fought back when she was being squeezed by members of the European Parliament, which had largely to do with things that were happening in Spain. Callas also performed well. Those who have been in the commission now for even longer, some of them, than von der Leyen, Šefčovič, Dombrovskis, and they, I think, are heavyweights in that commission, but they're careful. They're smooth operators. And then there are many other members of that college which are rather weak compared to previous members of the college. And some in the hearings, by the way, were even weaker than many had expected.
And why, Fabian, do we think that is? Is it that governments don't see the value of sending a heavy hitter to the commission, or because it's so centrally controlled, it's not so appealing to heavy hitters? Why do you think, if it is a weaker commission, why do you think that is? And is that a matter for concern? Or, and we're going to come on to the challenges this new team will face, maybe that central control a good thing at a stage like this, given your caveat about bottlenecks?
I think what we have is a mixture of different reasons. Clearly, it also has something to do with what is happening in domestic politics in a number of countries. But we shouldn't forget that also Ursula von der Leyen took an influence into this process. When we look at Breton, for example, clearly there was also a deliberate sorting of who she wanted to have in her commission. I think this can work out more effectively in some ways. I think we have more coherence, and that can be more powerful when it is focused on particular issues. I think clearly one of the issues which is always there is this question of silos, and how do you overcome these silos? So having more coherence can be helpful in that. However, at the same time, we have this bottlenecking problem. So if the Commission could also change some of its working practices, looking at some of the structural innovations Janis and I have talked about, then I think it could be much more effective. Otherwise, I think there's a danger that the bandwidth just isn't there to cover all the different issues which need to be covered. and that it will be very much an issue-by-issue approach, which doesn't deliver the overall structural changes which are needed and the overall change in mindset which is needed. It really needs a very different approach so that we address the challenges at a scale and at a scope which is corresponding to what we are facing.
And Janis, your thoughts on that, and in terms of the sort of changes in the way the Commission works that you've been calling for?
I think so it's adding to what Fabian said, if you look into the next coming 5 years, I think what is safe to assume is that the next 5 years will definitely not be easier than the last 5 or the last 10. That is not good news, given if you look back over the past 10 years, how many difficult crises you had to go through. But I think the assumption is safe to argue that what we will have ahead of us will not be easier. It probably will be an even tougher ride. That links to the question you were posing. Having then a strong president in place can also be an asset. Provided that that person is ready to provide the leadership which is needed, and is also able to play her role in this case as being member of the European Council. We often forget that she is member of the European Council. However, having said that, and that's the other part of the other side of the coin, is it then good to have a weak college and a strong president? I don't think that that's the right logic. You need to have a strong president who is in charge, who people know when the going gets tough, she's the one who will be calling the shots. But you also need to have strong members of the cabinet, so members of the college in this case. So if you look into the different portfolios, the links between the different issues, the opposition you have from a lot of member states with respect to what the Commission will be proposing and should be proposing. And so having a strong college is also in the interest of a strong president.
Indeed. Janis, just staying with you for a moment in terms of the hearings, you watched a lot of them. Your take on whether the process really worked. I mean, you said at the beginning, mainly they stuck to the script, they stuck to what was in the mission letters. I have heard criticisms that the way they were conducted, really, we didn't learn anything, and that it didn't really enable us to have a sense of whether these people were fit for the portfolios they'd been given. Was that your sense? And do you think there is within the European Parliament a sort of reflection now on, does this process really work, or do we need to rethink how we do it?
Well, in general, what I have often heard of people who were following those hearings was the word they were dull. They were not at the same level as we have seen hearings in the past. That has to do, one, with the conscious efforts of the designated commissioners to be extremely cautious, accommodative, often very repetitive, sending the same signal out all over again, with some exceptions, as I mentioned, Ribera, for example. But it was also the sign of the times. Given that there was a more or less attempt, at times an agreement, an attempt which then became more difficult to make sure that no one will shoot down the Commission designate of the others. And that was different over the 5 years ago, 10 years ago. You had casualties, political casualties, because of the hearings. You have the European Parliament saying no, committees saying no to certain designated commissioners. This time around, the atmosphere was, how are we going to find a way that our commissioners are not being shut down? And we do that by not attacking other commissioners.
So effectively rendering the process slightly pointless.
Well, I think that to a certain degree, yes. And I think that's also a reason why people felt that it was a dull process and a lot of people were not witnessing. Ask people, even in this town, of how many people actually witnessed the hearings. And if you then ask in national capitals, did you follow what happened in Brussels and Strasbourg when it comes to the hearings and the formation of the Commission? People will be telling you no, because there are other things which are more important. But that has to do with the political configuration, the outcome of the parliament election, and with the system as such. And the system is such that it does not allow structurally, if there's not a willingness to do so politically, structurally is not being formed in a way that you actually grill those commissioners in order to make sure that they will do what they should be doing in the upcoming 5 years.
Absolutely. And Fabian, in terms of more broadly, as Janis said, new parliament, this is the first time really we see it in action. We see how the political groups are manoeuvring between themselves. In terms of its work over the next 5 years, the cooperation between pro-European forces, and these widespread predictions before the elections that a very fragmented parliament would emerge and would not be able to operate. Do you think developments since the summer have borne out those concerns? Or in fact, are we seeing, I mean, Manfred Weber seems to have been very much the mastermind behind getting to where we are today and seems to have done it and sort of aligned forces very effectively. Does that suggest actually this parliament will be more cohesive, more coherent over the next 5 years, or do we still have concerns about the fragmentation?
Well, firstly, I would say that those who said after the election that nothing really much has changed, I think should really look again, because we are seeing that the political processes, the different types of alliances have shifted, and that we are now seeing also an overall shift to the right. And certainly the EPP and Weber have been the main beneficiaries of that. They have been able to locate themselves in the center between these different forces. So it has been rather effective from that perspective. However, does that mean it will be effective when it comes to policy issues? And I think that is a very different question. I think mustering votes to get to a political compromise is one thing. But when we are getting to the controversial legislation which has to go through the parliament, is that going to work as well? And I suspect that what we are going to see is what we have also warned about, is that it just gets more difficult, that it's harder to construct the majorities. It's harder to have something clear which comes out of the parliament.
Thank you.
I think,
Janis, a quick word to this, and then let's move on to the council and the new president.
well, on the one hand, we see it is a more fragmented parliament, and also in its operation is more difficult to put together majorities, and there are political games which happen in front and behind the scenes in order to make sure that you have, especially from the EPP side, room of maneuver to either look for different majorities or find majorities further to the right of the political spectrum, or put pressure on the traditional mainstream parties. But what I worry most about is what has happened over the past weeks or months leading up to today, is that the process has undermined the trust among the pro-European mainstream parties. There is a lot of distrust among them. And if I would put myself into being a strategist of an anti-EU coalition, if I would put myself into someone who's advising Orban or being Orban myself, I would be happy about this, because it undermines trust among mainstream parties and plays into the hand of those who actually want to hollow out the EU from within. Now, the European Parliament is not the only and not the key actor in the interinstitutional power game, but the fact that you have this increasing distrust among pro-European mainstream parties at a time where there is increasing pressure from the right, including from across the Atlantic, because Trump will have Orban in his ears when it comes to how he should operate when it comes to the EU. This is not the right thing to do. So it's petite politics, which at the end, I think, harm the big picture.
Thank you very much. And we'll come back to what all of this means in terms of the response to Trump. But I just want now to turn to the European Council. New president, António Costa, takes office December the 1st. And he's been giving some interviews over the last week. First time he's really talked about how he sees the role. Janis, what have we learned so far, and what do we know about his style of leadership and the approach he's likely to take?
I think if he's the 4th president of the European Council who will come into office, So we still don't have a very long tradition, but we have a tradition. And he seems to be more in the tradition of someone who's trying to see compromises, trying to seek where the different positions are, how one can align themselves, trying to be less of a president and more of a chairman. That's something which we saw very strongly with Herman Van Rompuy from the beginning. What he is doing, he is, and you were already mentioning that he has been communicating towards the outside world, so he is also trying to explain himself towards the outside in the Brussels context, predominantly up till now, beyond his national context where people know him. But I think that's something which Donald Tusk was not doing in the beginning, who was rather shy when it came to positioning himself in the first year in office in the Brussels domain. He later on did it. So we see that this is someone who is trying to see compromises, but he's also trying to play a role on the political scene. And I hope, and also when you see it, the choices he has made with respect to his inner circle, including some of his close advisors, speechwriters, I think that he will be also trying to explain certain things of what his political compass looks like, what he wants to achieve, how he wants to get there. And I think this is the right thing to do at this present point in time. Now, if you compare that to what we were witnessing over the past 5 years, it is extremely different from what we witnessed during those 5 years and during the first 10 years compared to the last 5.
Thank you. And Fabian, when it comes to relations with the European Commission, in those interviews, he has said, and I'm quoting, I think, from an interview he did with the Financial Times, we have an institutional framework that sometimes creates problems, but the most important thing is the dynamics of the individuals and the commitment and trust in their relations. How do you think, I mean, would you agree with that it's in the end, it's not structural so much as the personalities? And if so, how things might be different this time around? He says he has a great relationship with Ursula von der Leyen already, but they need to work out how you do that at the working level. Do you think, again, things will change significantly? And how important is that? Because then I want to come on to whether, with this constellation of the three institutions we're talking about, we are more fit for purpose to meet the challenges we face. But how do you see that working?
Well, I think firstly, it's also noteworthy that he's giving these signals. I mean, he's clearly saying also across the Rue de la Loi that we are going to work differently together than what you've seen before. And in that sense, it is already an improvement. It's already better by a long way than what we have seen before, because it has been, I would say, pretty much a breakdown in that relationship. So what we are going to see, I think, is an attempt to work better together. I think the key question for me is not whether you can have a better relationship. I think that clearly is important, but it's not enough. The question is, can the two of them act together to be more ambitious, to bring policy solutions to the council, to make sure that there is this coalition building, this bringing the member states on board. And in that, they actually have to strategically work together. They have to tactically work out how are we going to do that. What we've seen in the past, for example, is the capital diplomacy. The council president not only chairing, but actually actively going and talking to the governments, selling solutions to the kind of challenges we face. So I would hope that that's the kind of approach we're going to see. But that also means sharing power a bit. And I'm not sure in how far the Commission president is really ready to accept that that is an important component of what we have to do.
Indeed. He said in, yes, I know you want to react to that, but let me just throw in, because we will need to move on shortly, but he also said something that would certainly be music to my ears, and probably to many people who have to read these interminable word salads that are council conclusions very often. He said, it is not uncommon for EU summits to stretch late into the night as leaders fight over the wording of joint conclusions, often several pages long. What we want is shorter written conclusions. And he said we need each council to focus on a political message. So does this mean the end of sort of meaningless platitudes repeated in every council conclusion, do you think? But also to the other point.
I believe that he will try. But we have seen that there are counter objectives which do not allow that to happen, because when the 27 come to Brussels, they also have 27 national audience they want to please. They want to send out certain signals. They want to make sure that what they consider to be important in the national debate will be also reflected. So sending out one clear signal, reducing what will come out of European Council conclusions, I think that is something which has been tried.
Saying,
he
good
will
luck,
try,
Mr. Costa.
but it will be difficult. It will be difficult. But just to add to one, there is obviously an institutional dimension to the relationship which needs to be taken into account. But if you look back over the past 15 years, 3 experiences thus far with having a semi-permanent president of the European Council in place for 5 years, we've seen how much personalities do matter. Yeah. And the last 2 cooperations across with the law have been either very negative or negative. And by the way, not only with respect to the presidents, but also with respect to the level below when it comes to the head of cabinets across with the loi. So personalities matter even beyond the presidents. But what we've had was an experience where you had a president of the commission who had already been in office, Barroso, and a new person, Herman Van Rompuy, coming into office. And Barroso understood, and Herman Van Rompuy was the first semi-permanent president of the European Council. He understood that at the end, he should cooperate with the president of the European Council because this was in his interest. So it will be determined by herself, by von der Leyen, whether she will understand that at the end, cooperating with him will be not only in the interest of the EU, as Fabian was alluding towards, or should be, but it will also be in her personal interest. We will see, because it is personalities and a lot of things can happen on the way, but structurally that's how they should be approaching it and how she should be approaching it.
Thank you very much. We will come back to the question when we discuss a little bit more the challenges that Trump 2 poses. We'll come back to the question of whether, having looked at all 3 institutions and the power plays we've seen in the last couple of months, whether you think the EU is genuinely better equipped to face both the geopolitical turbulence and the arrival of Trump 2. I'm going to take one question from our audience before we move on to want to have 2 words on Romania and the shock presidential election first round result and Trump 2. But Malcolm Harbour, you have your hand raised. Your question, please.
Yes, well,
got you.
Yeah, well, good morning, everyone. Well, it's been fascinating to listen to this, and I was interested that Janis reflected back on time with Barroso and Van Rompuy, which is the time when I was chairman of the Internal Market Committee, and also I conducted a number of their commissioner hearings. So some very quick snapshots. First of all, I think the Parliament really has chairmanship is crucial to making these commission hearings work. And the problem is that you need to chair them really, really tightly. I mean, I refuse to, if anybody questioning the commissioner tried to ask more than 2 questions, I used to cut them off. The problem is that all these multiple questions. And secondly, for the first time in my hearings, we actually had the provision for supplementaries afterwards, so you can come back to people. And some people would insist on not sticking to trying to introduce a new question at the same time. And I get the impression that there's a real variation about the quality of chairmanships. And that's something that I think that the President of the Parliament should seriously address for the next time round. She has plenty of time to do it. So that's just an operational
very briefly
issue.
now, Malcolm.
But I mean, I think, can I just come back to the core point? Is this commission going to adopt what the government in the UK and others are doing and focus far more on its critical missions and try to pull people together around that? And actually, her new structure seems to be encouraging more of that focus. And I'm reminded, and this is my just final point of history, is that the core thing in the Barroso Commission was about the Lisbon strategy. And the Lisbon strategy, Parliament had its own working group around that, and that actually was, I think, a very successful movement forward. And that's and they have the Draghi report, actually to form a basis for that.
Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you very much, and thank you for sharing your experiences. Fabian, Janis, would one of you like to react on that?
Well, I think we're coming back to what we have said in previous updates. It is good to have the Draghi report and the Letta report and the Niinistö report as guidance for the kind of actions we do. But the key question is going to be implementation. So what we have also talked about in our structural innovations paper is using, for example, some form of task forces to be able to push these issues forward. But I'm afraid that unless you do something structural, it's likely to be rather less convincing. I think we are going to see that the bottlenecking, the difficulty in getting things through will be dominant rather than having this greater focus on certain missions, certain outcomes.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to take the issue of the Romanian elections in the context of Trump too, because I do see a potential connection between the two things. So let us move on to Trump too. And Janis, same really question as I asked you about what have we learned about from the mission letters and the hearings and so on. What have we learned, do you think, so far from Trump's pronouncements, both about his team, both about some policy areas, most notably so far what he said about tariffs on Mexico, on Canada, on China? What have we learned, and do you think it basically reinforces the notion he's going to do what he said in the campaign, or do we see any areas where maybe he will row back a bit? What should the EU, what lessons should the EU draw from what they've heard and seen so far?
I think that we do not know whether he will do what he promised during the election campaign, but he will try to do what he promised during the election campaign. When you witness the formation of his team, you see that he has a strong emphasis on those things he was discussing and highlighting during the campaign: migration, things related to government efficiency, how to deal with what they call the deep state when it comes to the economy, tariffs. So both in the nominations, but also in what he has said he would be doing and what he has already started doing. So it feels already as if he is partially in office, although it's still a couple of months to go until the 20th of January. So one can assume that he will try to do what he has promised to do. And if you look into the people who he has selected those who will be ready to do what he will be asking them. They're being screened very thoroughly. People say that they're being screened by Don Jr., by his son, as to whether they will actually be ready to do what he wants, or even to do things which they think that he wants to do. So he wants people who will be subordinate and clearly subordinate to him. He also is looking, by the way, for people very much who are able to communicate. So he's looking into how they are presenting themselves in media, which is interesting, which probably has to do with the fact that he himself is a heavy consumer of the media he wants to listen to. So we're seeing that along the lines of what he has promised, he's trying to get that through. That means that we should take everything we have had seriously. The question is, how much will he actually be able to deliver? How far can he go? So not only how far he will try to go, but how far he can go. If you look into the question of mass deportations, he was talking about millions. If you do your maths about how many people in the US are illegally, are there actually so many criminals? So how are you going to get to these numbers? What will be the effects in the public debate? How will it affect even those who are supportive of him? This is only one example. If he goes for tariffs, what are going to be the reactions? What are the economic consequences? How will the markets respond to that? This seems to be a key which we should have in mind, that he's very worried about how the markets react to some of the things he's doing or will be doing. And I could go on.
Bit of an irony that he's screening very carefully for, will they do what I want them to do? He's screening less carefully, as we saw with Matt Gaetz, for are they appropriate human beings to be in these offices. But Fabian, your sense, and some people taking comfort from the fact that he has nominated Marco Rubio to be Secretary of State, saying this is much more of a conventional Republican than a MAGA, as it were, and maybe suggests that on the world stage, at least, he will be more conventional than he has threatened to be. Should the EU take comfort from that? Or do you think what we've seen so far means if the EU hasn't woken up to this watershed, they really need to quickly now?
I think we should absolutely not take comfort from that. I think firstly, we don't know how this relationship is going to work out inside the US administration. But what we have seen, and I think that was also expected, is that the most important issue for Trump has been loyalty. It has been about getting people who will follow whatever he decides to put on the table. So the expectation that Rubio will in some way do a separate, more adult foreign policy is an illusion. But even if that could be the case, I think we really have to start thinking about worst case scenarios. We have to be prepared for the worst case. It might be that it then doesn't come to that. But it is much better to be prepared for the worst case and then live in a better reality than the other way around.
Okay, let's
And I
take
think
some
what we are seeing also is when we're looking at the overall theme of the foreign policy engagement, we're talking about confrontation. We're talking about massive tariffs across the board, which are going to, yes, possibly be negotiated downwards, but the deterioration in the overall environment is very clear.
Well, let's take that tariff issue. I'm going to have a sort of quick fire on some of the key issues. In terms of the tariffs issue, what do you think the EU should do in response? Should it try, and we've seen slight attempts, so this Ursula von der Leyen talking about buying more LNG from America, attempts to appease Trump, or should the EU be taking a very tough stand? We've seen the Mexican president this week say in response to what he said about tariffs on Mexico, yet talking is, we're happy to dialogue, but in the end, we'll retaliate. If you do it, we'll retaliate. Janis, should the EU talk tough or try to appease?
Probably we need to do both. But just to make sure, and I think we should not fall into the trap and be naive, when he will be calling on us with respect to the tariffs, and we need to respond, he will also be linking this to other issues. So he will also be saying, this is not only about the tariff issues and as to whether you will do what I want, but it also to do with Ukraine, it has to do with NATO, it has to do with the overall role the US is willing, and I, as a president in the next 4 years, is willing to play or not in some of the very difficult choices you will have to make, in difficult situations you will find yourselves. So he will be pushing us from different areas. So that means also that our response needs to take that into account. What I'm asking myself is whether we will also be confronted with a president who will also try and listen to the Orbáns of Europe. So whether he will try to undermine us more systematically so that it's not only transactional logic, but whether he also sees us and the EU, which he despises. He's not in favor of multilateralism, obviously. So he doesn't like the EU being a sovereign organization, which is supranational. So he despises the EU. And the question is, will he try to more systematically, as he will probably try to do in the US when it comes to the democratic institutions in the US, will he try to help those who want to undermine the EU and help them? So I think we need to think all these things with each other, which, by the way, means that it will be extremely difficult for the EU 27 to deal with this, because many of the things we will have to do and want to do, we have to do united, and some might not want to do them because they feel that they have an interest of not being part of it. So
an interesting point there. With Mexico, he's linked it to illegal migration. He's linked it to drugs. In the EU, you think he will link it to defense spending, to Ukraine, to those sorts of issues. So it'll be different issues for different people.
And he will be listening to those who will be telling him in his ears what to do. And that might be totally different issues.
I'll come back on that in a moment, if I might. On Ukraine, Fabian, please do add a word on tariffs if you want to, but on Ukraine, two questions really. We have already seen attempts to bolster support for Ukraine in the run-up to January 20th when Trump takes office. We're seeing much more of an emphasis. We had a meeting of the 5 biggest defense spenders this week in the EU, in Europe, because it included the UK, and talking about, addressing the capability gaps. There seems to be a more emphasis now on giving Ukraine money to build up its own arms industry rather than only supplying weapons. How do you see the EU's preparations for this? And there's a question from Dimitri Kopakis saying, in the event that Trump moves alone into some form of peace agreement with Putin without consulting much with Europe, what are the likely scenarios ahead?
Well, firstly, I think it's extremely likely that Trump will do whatever he wants to do without consulting Europe.
Yeah.
He does not care about what we think. I think there's even a question whether he will consult Ukraine. That's not right, because Ukraine should be the core decision maker when it comes to any kind of ceasefire or peace deal. But yes, there's a chance. It's not necessarily the case, but there's a chance, and probably I would say more than 50%, that he will try to get some form of deal so that we have a cessation of hostilities. It might be called a peace deal. It's not a peace deal. And I think this is where Europe has to be much, much clearer in our own mind, that what we are facing there is a ongoing security threat to Europe. And that is not going to go away. Whether there is a ceasefire deal, whether there is some form of imposed peace deal, we are going to still face that threat, and Ukraine is going to continue to face that threat. So logically, what we actually have to do is we have to do even more. Now, part of that is also in defense spending, and this is maybe one of the very few areas where I have some agreement with Donald Trump, because I think it is right that Europe will have to do much more for its own defense, for its own security. And if Donald Trump will push us towards the NATO spending targets, I think that's a good thing. But ultimately, what we have to recognize is that we will have to, whatever happens in the White House, we will have to take more responsibility, and we will have to continue to face this threat from Russia, which means we will have to continue to prepare, and we have to continue to be able to fight this war. And that also means that we have to ramp up production facilities. But I would say it's not a question of either or. It's not a question of even do we buy it from America or do we buy it from Europe? We have to do all of that. We have to help the Ukrainians to increase production. We have to increase our own production, and we have to buy from America. It's all of that.
Janis.
First of all, consult Europe. I think we need to think differently. He will be consulting some Europeans. He will be close to some in Europe, including Viktor Orban, but not only, who will providing him with advice of what to do, which means that if we need to react to that reality, the question is, who is that we? And I think that will be a real challenge for the EU, for the EU27, which requires in these areas unity, which requires unanimous decisions, which requires consensus. If you will structurally be under pressure from Washington, and some within the club will not allow you to define that collective we at the EU level. So that will be putting the EU under enormous pressure as an organization and institution. The question is then, how do you react to that? And we, as those who believe that Ukraine deserves our support, and it is in our enlightened self-interest to support the Ukrainians, even if Washington wants something else, how those forces will be ready to support continuously Ukraine in that period, which will be a very difficult one in case something is being imposed on them. It comes to security countries, it comes to economy, it comes to money, it comes to weapons. We we'll have to define what the we is and have to support the Ukrainians. That will be very difficult from a European perspective, I fear. And those who want to undermine the EU will play exactly in that direction. And
Okay.
the last
Can I
point,
just-
the
can I
last
just-
point is, even
Okay.
if we come to 2025 and there is some movement, and Fabian indicated in which direction potentially might be going, actually, we need to prepare ourselves for 2030. The lesson is from 14 to 22, we didn't do what we should be doing. And 22 to 30, we need to be do what we have to do, because Putin, Moscow, Russia will prepare themselves. And what military experts are telling us, in 5-6 years, they will be ready and they might do other things. And now convince
Sorry,
you,
Janis,
our
I'm going
European
to have to stop you
publics
because
of what
we've
we
got
need to do. Sorry,
questions from the audience and other issues to talk about. A question linked to your point about what Ricardo Borges de Castro is calling the Orban-Trump bromance. He says Hungary has recently become the main destination for Chinese direct investment on your electric vehicles. I'll come back to the issue of China relations, but he's asking, do you think the fact that Hungary is now the main destination for that investment, could it undermine the bromance between Orban and Trump? That question to you, and then to you, Fabian, a question about the broader relationship, which I'll come to in a second. But Janis.
Actually, I think, given the history of their bromance, as Ricardo was calling it, it's a long history. And it is something which not only are they very close to each other, but it's also the fact that Trump himself is looking up to him. He feels that Orban is a role model, is someone who has shown the path, which he, obviously, the situation is totally different in the US. The US is a different country. It's not about copying, but the direction of what to do and how to do it. That is something which he feels really not only attracted towards, but he feels that this is his mentor. So I think that the relationship between these two men is very close, and we know from Trump that personal relationships do matter. Now, things can also divert them. We've seen that also in the past. But we see, with respect to the relationship with Viktor Orban, this has been a very long-standing relationship between them.
So things like this will not derail it. Just on the question of EU-China, Chen Weihua from the China Daily, he's the EU bureau chief, asks Fabian, at this critical juncture, should the EU and China unite and cooperate more? He says, in order to uphold multilateralism and build a stable multipolar world, or should the EU, his words, collude with the US to get tough on China in return for some leniency on trade tariffs? In this battle, as it were, between the US and China, which is set to intensify when Trump takes office again, where should the EU position itself, if I can put it in a more neutral way?
The first point I would make is that there has always been many areas of difference between the EU and the US. We have disagreed on many things. We have disagreed on many things during the first Trump presidency, but we've also disagreed on a number of things with the Biden administration, with previous administrations before that. One of those in recent years has unfortunately been multilateralism, because we don't see the commitment from the US for the multilateral system. However, a multilateral system is a system which is rules-based, where everybody is willing to uphold those rules. And this is where I would make a difference to multipolarity. Multipolarity is not an ordering principle. So if we want a multilateral world, we need much more commitment from everybody to uphold common rules and not to undermine also country sovereignty. And this brings me to the core issue, which I think is also influencing the EU-China relationship, which is the war of Russia against Ukraine, where we are seeing that the multilateral rules, the global system is breaking down. Because a country, an independent country, has been invaded, its sovereignty and its territorial integrity has been threatened, or even in the case of territorial integrity, we now have the enforced incorporation of parts of Ukrainian territory into the Russian Federation. So if China wants to have a more constructive relationship with Europe, and that is not going to lead to a complete turning away from the United States, because we have many different ties, and it's also not just a government-to-government tie. But if China wants to do that, then the core question is, what is China's stance on the war? And is China going to do more to restrain Russia? And not to forget in that context, sorry, just a last word on that, that we have now seen an escalation by Russia, because Russia has now brought in North Korea. So it has actually extended this conflict into the Asia Pacific. So we have to be much, much more clear that this is the biggest threat Europe faces, and whatever relationships we have with other countries will be determined by that.
By that. Thank you very much.
And
I'm going to have to move on. Sorry, Janis, because I want to talk about democracy, and I want to then try and draw some conclusions about what this means. Also, John Palmer, I know you have your hand raised. I'm going to try and squeeze you in a moment. But I wanted to come back and link this to something that Janis was saying about who Trump will listen to in Europe. The other side of the coin is the impact, Janis, that Trump's victory in the US and some of the things he's proposing, whether they will be seized on, will they embolden the far right in Europe in terms of some of the policy proposals they make? How do you see the impact on our democracy of what is happening in the US, if you do? And link to that the Romanian question, because we saw that win in the first round of the presidential election, a shock win for somebody who was barely known in Romania. He came out first in the first round. We'll see what happens in the second round. He knocked out the Social Democrat previous favorite to win. Is this, again, a sign of backlashes against incumbents in favor of mavericks, which we've seen a lot across the world? And also I'm linking it because it was attributed in part to Russian interference. He is not only a far-right politician, but he's also very pro-Russia. And whether the EU is really taking enough account of that threat as well. Lots of questions in one, but it's all related to the assault on democracy, if you like.
I think all the issues you mentioned are correct. And we see that all these issues play into now also the election result in Romania, but also in general, if you look into the election results across Europe, that many of those radical voices, often strongmen, who try to position themselves in the debate in a certain way, are having certain attractions. So there are similarities to what we're seeing and have been seeing in the US. But that's a phenomenon which we have had in Europe over many years. It's not something which is totally new. But for those who want that strengthening of the radical rights to continue, or to even get more dynamics, also look into the French elections in 27. For those who want that, they are looking across the pond and are carefully looking as to whether there potentially are successes of Trump internally also in the US, which they can use at home. So if we, for example, look into the mass deportation attempts in the US, again, I was saying earlier, we'll see as to whether practically this will work or not. But if it would be sending the signals to a lot of people, don't even try to come to the US. You don't even attempt to cross the border from Mexico to the US. Others in Europe will be saying, look, this is the right way of how we need to do it. When he will be countering what they call the deep state. And if those MAGA ideologists will be actually trying to turn around in the US structurally, as they argue, if you listen to them very concretely, turn around majorities and undermine the fact that the liberal left, as they argue, have been dominating things, that they will now want to be dominating structurally things and want to change the US in that direction. Again, we do not know whether that will work. He will try to do it, but we'll see how far he can get and how successful it will be. But these are things which have an impact on Europe directly. So yes, we're talking about the effects on Ukraine, rightly so, NATO, tariffs, all these direct potential consequences, what the election of Trump will potentially have. But we also need to look at these so-called more domestic issues in the US, because those who in Europe want to undermine Europe, want to undermine our liberal democracies, they are looking across the pond. So we also need to do that and fight back in terms of our rhetoric and potentially also our actions. So it is very much being coined by them of us against them. In the US, the people.
Indeed.
Trump,
Gonna have,
we need to understand that, because otherwise we're going to be naive.
Sorry, Janis, I know lots
Perfectly
to say.
fine.
We don't have much time. Fabian, you wanted to react. John has lowered his hand, so I guess that was the question he also wanted to ask. Fabian, a word from you on this, and then I just try to come back to our conversation about the EU and its institutions, and whether what we talked about earlier really makes the EU better equipped to respond to all of this, or you still have grave concerns. Fabian.
So I just wanted to be very clear that this is not about emboldening one part of the political spectrum over the other. This is emboldening anti-democratic forces. And what we are going to see is much more systemic attacks on our democracies, on our system. So this is very, very serious, because it is not just about who wins one election or the other. It is about a concerted attempt to undermine democracy. So Trump's election is bad news on many different fronts. It's bad news in terms of our prosperity. It's bad news in terms of sustainability. It's bad news in terms of security, but it's also very, very bad news for democracy.
Thank you. Okay, we have a couple of minutes left each, and I'm really going to be strict about this. Let's go back to our conversation we had in the first half of Update about the EU institutions. We looked at developments in the Commission, the Parliament and Council. And I just wanted to end by asking you whether you believe that as we look at all these immense challenges, and there are others we haven't been able to talk about today, we haven't talked about Gaza, we haven't been able to touch on the peace deal with Hezbollah, which for once is a bit of positive news, hopefully. But when you look at these constellation of challenges and the new EU institutional balance, do you think, Janis, 1.5 minutes each, that the EU is now better equipped to face up to these challenges, or are you still concerned that lack of leadership, and this is going to be the issue, by the way, we're going to focus on at the EPC's annual conference next week, which I will have the privilege of moderating, do you think we still have a leadership deficit that is going to cause us problems? Janis?
Along the lines of what Fabian was saying with respect to the new realities we're facing at the global level, put us immensely under pressure, even our democracies even more under pressure, plus the concrete effects which has had. The challenge we now have is much bigger than it was. And I fear that the EU will be squeezed in a way, or potentially squeezed in a way we have never seen before, because we might face a situation where reaching unanimity under the pressure of a severe crisis will be not attainable. We always have this crisis automaticity logic that once we get pressured, once we get squeezed, we will do what is necessary. I am not sure that this will prove to be the case this time around. And I think that there are a lot of actors within and outside Europe who want the EU to fail. So if we get to that point, then leadership really comes up, because potentially then we have to think of leadership also outside the EU, because the EU might be paralyzed in this situation. So that is why we need to very fundamentally think of what the potential consequences of this is, while also having the more narrow thinking about EU institutions in mind. But we need to think also beyond that.
Thank you very much. Fabian?
I would say there are two things we really have to guard ourselves against. One is what is already starting to become the narrative among many of the more liberal-minded people, which is it won't be as bad as you think, and we just have to wait for this presidency to pass, and then we go back to something which is the normal. We should be very clear that this is a watershed moment, and that this also requires the dramatic different steps, which we did take in part in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So we have to do the same kind of mindset change, which should have happened back then. And my second point is what we have talked about many times in the update as well. I really fear that we're going to see the progress illusion coming back in a big way, that yes, we are going to do some things, but they are not going to be anywhere near the scale and the scope of the challenge which we are facing.
And I'm sure we will come back to that again. And we certainly will, as I mentioned, next Thursday, December the 5th, is the EPC's annual conference, Leading Europe in the New Era. Will very much be focusing on the leadership that is required at this stage, where it might come from, and what we need to do. There'll be new speakers being announced very shortly to complete our program. I'll have the privilege of moderating that. I do hope to see many of you there. It'd be lovely to see our EPC update regulars, who I only see online, actually to see you and afterwards have a little drink with you at the reception. Just also to mention later today, a hybrid policy dialogue on EU enlargement as a geopolitical imperative for transatlantic security. Next Monday, we haven't touched on it today, we didn't have time, an online policy dialogue on COP29, unpacking COP29, what's next for global climate action. And apart from the annual conference, we will be back with another post-summit briefing EPC update after the December summit, immediately after it ends on the afternoon of December the 20th. Hope to see, as I say, many of you next week, and otherwise look forward to seeing you online in December the 20th. Janis, Fabian, thank you very much, as always. And thank you. I'm sorry I'm so tough on the timing, but we have so much to discuss all the time, and it's also very interesting. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.
Thank you.